Story 1. It all went down on New Year's Eve in 2017. I am originally from a small town just outside Cleveland, Ohio, and that night, I was flying back home after wrapping up another semester at a university in upstate New York. For some personal reasons, I had stayed behind an extra week after classes ended, so I ended up spending Christmas mostly on my own. The flight itself was uneventful, but my mood had already hit rock bottom before I even stepped on the plane. I am a diehard Cleveland Browns fan, and that day, while I was waiting at the airport, they managed to lose their final game of the season, sealing a humiliating 0-16 record. A completely winless season. Let me tell you, as someone who bleeds orange and brown, that kind of disappointment stings. I think we were the first team to achieve that honor since the 1980s or something. To make matters worse, my flight got delayed, which threw a wrench into my family's New Year's Eve plans. The original idea was that we would all pile into the car and head to my cousin's place for a big party and stay overnight. But since my flight was pushed back, my parents decided to head out early without me, taking the main family car. That left me stuck with the backup ride, driving solo. My mom felt bad about it, so she left our golden retriever, Daisy, at home to keep me company. Daisy was one of those dogs that could lift your spirits even on the worst days, so I figured her company would make the long drive less miserable. Still, I was not thrilled about the situation. By the time the Uber dropped me off from the airport, it was already closing in on 10 o'clock at night. I did not even bother unpacking my stuff. I just threw my bags in the car, grabbed Daisy, locked up the house, and hit the road. The drive was exactly what you would expect from rural Ohio at night, endless backroads cutting through stretches of fields and patches of forest. There was only a light dusting of snow on the ground, which was a blessing since driving in heavy snow stresses me out. But it was pitch black out there. The only light came from my car's headlights and the occasional glow of a farmhouse porch in the distance. About halfway into the trip, Daisy started whining. At first, I thought she just wanted some attention, but then she stood up and began pacing in the passenger seat. That is when it clicked, she needed a bathroom break. With no other options, I pulled over at the next clearing I found. It was a small patch of dirt on the side of the road, barely big enough for my car, but it would have to do. The first thing that hit me when I stepped out was how incredibly dark it was. If not for the faint white patches of snow scattered around, I probably would not have been able to see anything beyond the edge of the trees. I stuffed my hands into my jacket pockets to keep them warm while Daisy sniffed around. She was a classic golden retriever, oblivious to the cold and completely unbothered by the darkness. I did not bother putting her on a leash since she never wandered far during these little pit stops. She was sniffing near the edge of the woods, taking her sweet time. That is when I heard it. A loud crashing noise tore through the quiet night. It was not the sound of a single branch breaking, it was heavier, deliberate, like something big was moving through the trees. I jumped like a kid hearing thunder for the first time. It honestly sounded like a grown man was charging through the forest. I froze, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out anything, but it was useless. The trees swallowed up everything past the first few feet. And before I could process what was happening, Daisy took off like a rocket, disappearing into the woods. It was the kind of moment that feels like a scene straight out of a horror movie. 1 second, she was there, and the next, she was gone. I yelled her name over and over, my voice echoing in the cold night, but there was no sign of her. My heart was pounding, and I could feel panic creeping in. The freezing air only made it harder to think clearly. I knew I could not leave her out there alone. Without another thought, I bolted into the woods after her, yelling her name into the darkness. Whatever she was chasing, I did not want to know. My only focus was getting her back, and I let pure adrenaline guide my way. The only thing lighting my way was the weak beam from my phone flashlight and the faint layer of snow covering the ground. It was so dark, I kept smacking into trees as I ran. My mind raced with every step, praying I would find Daisy before she got too close to whatever was out there. I kept going until my lungs burned and the cold air felt like knives in my chest. Eventually, I had to stop. I was gasping for air, leaning heavily against a tree, and on the verge of breaking down. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do next. And then, finally, I saw her. Daisy emerged from the shadows, moving slowly, crouched low to the ground with her tail tucked tightly between her legs. She was trembling all over. I had never seen her like that before. Relief and panic hit me at the same time. I dropped to my knees, calling her softly, and she pressed herself against me, shivering uncontrollably. As I held her, I felt her fear. Whatever was out there had terrified her. That is when reality smacked me in the face. We were still in the middle of the woods, and whatever had scared Daisy was still out there. My heart started pounding again, and I knew we had to get out of there fast. I stood up quickly, whispering for Daisy to stick close. This time, she stayed right by my side, her usual playful spirit replaced by sheer terror. We started back toward where I thought the car was, but the truth was, I had no idea if I was going the right way. As if things could not get any worse, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a loud crashing sound behind me. It was closer this time, deliberate, like it was following us. Instinct took over, and I bolted. Daisy darted ahead of me, and I trusted her to lead the way. I just ran, praying I would not trip or fall. The crashing noises did not stop. Whatever it was right behind us, chasing us. My heart felt like it was going to burst, and for the first time in my life, I truly thought I was not going to make it out alive. Then, like a miracle, Daisy led me straight back to the car. I could hardly believe it when I saw it. I threw the car door open and practically shoved her inside before slamming it shut. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to get into the driver's seat. Before I turned the key in the ignition, I made the mistake of glancing back toward the woods. My stomach turned to ice. Standing at the tree line were three figures, motionless, just watching us. My body acted on autopilot. I jammed the key into the ignition, slammed my foot on the gas, and tore out of there like my life depended on it. I did not look back, I did not even slow down. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt, and my mind was racing with a mix of fear and disbelief. It was not until I had driven several miles that I noticed something was wrong with Daisy. She was bleeding. My heart sank as I spotted a gash just below her shoulder blade. I realized, with horror, that someone, or something, had hurt her. I pulled over and scrambled to the trunk, my mind spinning. Luckily, my mom always kept a first aid kit in every car. Her knack for over-preparing finally paid off. I cleaned the wound as best I could, wrapping it tightly in gauze while Daisy whimpered. My hands were shaking, and I was so scared I might be hurting her, but I knew I had to help. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I started to calm down. The immediate danger seemed to be over. I climbed back into the driver's seat and kept going, trying not to think about what had just happened. Even now, I do not know why I never told my parents or anyone else about that night. Maybe it was because I was too shaken, or maybe I just knew no one would believe me. Whatever the reason, it felt like one of those things better left unsaid. Story 2. What I am about to share with you is something that still crosses my mind frequently, especially when this time of year rolls around. It happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago, a night I will not forget anytime soon. I was driving to visit my parents to ring in the new year with them. They live a few hours away in the quieter, snow-covered hills of upstate Pennsylvania. I had set out in the late afternoon, planning to arrive well before midnight. The plan was simple enough. I have always enjoyed long drives. They give me time to clear my head, enjoy the road, and reflect on life. But nature, as it often does, had a completely different idea for how my evening would unfold. About an hour into the trip, tiny flakes of snow began to fall. At first, it was nothing more than a light dusting on the windshield, a scene straight out of a postcard. I even caught myself smiling, thinking how beautiful the snowfall looked under the fading daylight. In hindsight, I should have known better than to think it would stay that way. The snow intensified steadily. Light flurries gave way to a relentless storm, and before I knew it, I was driving straight into a full-blown blizzard. The highway quickly turned into a slick, white maze. The world outside my car shrank, consumed by the thick snowfall. My little sedan was no match for the icy road, and it became obvious the further I went that I would not be able to keep going. The tires slipped with even the slightest incline, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the situation became truly dangerous. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the highway, far enough from the road to avoid passing cars, not that there were many at that point. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents to let them know what was going on. They were immediately worried, as I had expected, but I tried to assure them I was fine. Deep down, though, I was not sure of that myself. The plan was to wait out the worst of the storm, hoping it would ease up enough for me to get moving again. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and the hour turned into 2, it became painfully clear that the storm was not going to let up anytime soon. Snow piled up around my car, and the visibility outside remained next to nothing. My dad called, insisting he could try to come get me, but I shut that idea down immediately. Driving in this weather was a risk I could not let him take. Instead, I told him that if things got worse, would call the police for help. He reluctantly agreed but made me promise to follow through if I felt unsafe. I sat in the car, turning the engine on and off intermittently to conserve gas while staying warm. I was keenly aware of how long the night ahead might feel. The wind outside screamed like a banshee, and the loneliness started to set in. Just as I was beginning to accept the thought of spending the night there, something caught my eye, a faint glow in my rearview mirror. Headlights. A sense of relief washed over me as a vehicle approached, pushing through the thick snow. It was a snowplow, and it came to a stop right next to me. The driver rolled down his window, and I did the same. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had weathered decades of tough winters. He wore a heavy coat and a black knit hat pulled low over his ears. His eyes studied me for a moment before he spoke. "You doing all right?" he asked, his voice gravelly and rough, the kind of voice that comes from years of cigarettes and hard living. I told him the truth, that my car was not handling the snow and I did not think I could make it much farther. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that answer. After a pause, he offered me a ride. I hesitated. Accepting a ride from a stranger is not something I would normally consider, but staying in my car overnight with the storm still raging seemed far riskier. He seemed genuine, and I decided to trust him. "Can you take me to my parents' place?" I asked. "Sure," he said with a shrug, like it was no big deal. "What about my car?" I asked, glancing back at it. He just shrugged again. "Leave it." After a brief moment of hesitation, I agreed to the ride. I grabbed my bag, stepped out into the biting wind, and climbed into the cab of the snowplow. The warmth inside hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. It was a welcome break from the freezing cold outside. I settled into the seat, clutching my bag tightly, and told the driver where I needed to go. I gave him directions to my parents' house, and he nodded silently before shifting the plow into gear. At first, the silence felt normal. The kind of quiet you expect when two strangers are sharing a ride. But as the minutes passed, I started to feel a creeping unease. Something was off. That is when I noticed the route he was taking. It did not match the directions I had given him. My GPS was pointing us in the opposite direction entirely. The highway only had 2 ways to go, and we were heading the wrong way. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked him, are we going the right way? The GPS says it is back the other direction. My attempt to sound calm fell flat, and I could feel the atmosphere in the cab shift with my question. He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, and said, "We are taking a shortcut. The back roads will be easier than the highway in this storm." I did not know the area well enough to challenge him, but something about his tone tied my stomach in knots. Still, I told myself I was probably overthinking it. He did get off the highway eventually, and the GPS started recalculating to match the new route. It seemed like we were at least heading in the right direction now, so I tried to relax. But that nagging feeling in my gut just would not go away. As we rolled along the desolate back road, I started paying closer attention to my surroundings in the cab. That is when I noticed the details I had missed earlier. Empty liquor bottles rattled near his feet as the plow bounced over uneven patches of snow. Tattered maps were crammed into the door pockets, and worst of all, there was a knife wedged between the seats, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light of the cab. My pulse quickened. You know that feeling when your heart starts pounding so hard it feels like it might burst out of your chest? That is exactly what I was experiencing. I tried to calm myself, but the GPS kept recalibrating because he was ignoring turn after turn, barely glancing at it. By now, I was convinced we were not going anywhere near my parents' house. Panic began to creep in, and I knew I had to think fast. Up ahead, through the swirling snow, I saw a house. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in miles, and it felt like a beacon of hope. My instincts screamed at me to act. As we got closer, I tightened my grip on the door handle and took a deep breath. Without warning, I kicked the door open with all the strength I could muster. The icy wind hit me like a slap, but I did not stop. I jumped out of the cab, landing hard in the snow. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself to get up and run. Behind me, I heard the driver shout something, his voice muffled by the howling storm. I glanced back briefly and saw him fumbling with the glove compartment. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if he had a weapon? I did not wait to find out. I pushed myself harder, my boots slipping on the icy ground as I made a beeline for the house. When I reached the front door, I pounded on it desperately, yelling for help. Within moments, it swung open, and a man and woman pulled me inside. The warmth of their home enveloped me, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Between ragged breaths, I explained what had happened. They did not hesitate or ask questions. The man immediately called the police while the woman handed me a blanket and tried to calm me down. By the time the authorities arrived, the snowplow was long gone. The officers assured me they would search the area, but with the storm raging, they admitted it would be a challenge to find him. They offered to drive me to my parents' house, and they even helped me arrange a tow for my car. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I could not thank them enough. When I finally made it to my parents' house, my dad was furious when he heard what had happened. He made me promise never to take unnecessary risks on the road again. Since that night, I have avoided driving in heavy snow altogether. Every year around New Year's Eve, I think about that night. About how close I came to something far worse, and how lucky I was to spot that house when I did. I used to love the freedom of heading out on the open road, but now, I am much happier spending time at home with people I trust, doing something meaningful and safe. Story 3. I come from a small town in the backwoods of Minnesota, a place where winters are long and brutal. This story happened a couple of years ago, but it still feels fresh in my mind. Growing up, my dad and his friends had this New Year's Eve ritual. They would go ice fishing while most folks were out partying or ringing in the new year with family. My mom was not really in the picture, and we did not have much in the way of extended family, so my New Year's Eve tradition was always out on a frozen lake. It was just my dad, my uncle, my older brother, and a handful of my dad's buddies braving the cold together. My dad passed away a few years back, and my brother moved to Denver not long after that. Even so, I have always felt this pull to keep the tradition alive. Maybe it is out of respect for my dad or just a way to feel connected to those simpler times. Whatever it is, I find myself out there every year, no matter what. Thankfully, my two best friends, Eric and Kyle, are just as outdoorsy as I am. Picture those classic burly, flannel-wearing guys who look more at home in the wilderness than in a city. That is pretty much them, and honestly, that is me too. The three of us decided to keep the tradition alive together, which was a relief because spending New Year's Eve alone in the cold? Not exactly my idea of a good time. Eric was driving that year, and his truck was perfect for the trip. It had massive tires, four-wheel drive, and enough room in the bed to haul all our gear. We loaded up everything we needed: fishing rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled for hauling stuff, and a little pop-up shelter to protect us from the wind. The forecast said it would be clear, but anyone who has spent a winter in Minnesota knows better than to trust the weather report. The lake we were heading to was one of our favorite spots. It was not marked on any maps and was hidden by thick woods. The ice there stayed solid even during warmer stretches of winter. It was the kind of place you only knew about if someone showed you or if you had been coming there for years like we had. The drive out was quiet, except for the crunch of snow under the tires and the occasional joke from Eric. As we got closer, the excitement started to kick in. There is something special about ice fishing: the stillness, the focus, and the possibility of reeling in a big catch. For me, it beats a night at a noisy bar any day. When we pulled up near the trailhead, I noticed a man standing a few yards away. He was bundled up in heavy winter clothes, so it was hard to make out much about him. He was just standing there, staring at our truck. At first, I thought maybe he was another fisherman, but something about the way he kept looking back and forth between us and his phone felt strange. I could not explain it exactly, but the whole thing seemed off. I leaned over and muttered to Eric and Kyle, "Hey, that guy is creeping me out." Kyle shrugged it off, and Eric just nodded. "Probably nothing," Eric said. We got out and started unloading our gear. Before we could get far, the man suddenly ran toward us, waving his arms like a madman. I rolled down the truck window as he got close. His voice was panicked as he shouted, "You have got to help me." My buddy fell through the ice. He shoved his phone in our direction, pointing at it and yelling something about how the guy had just called him. His voice cracked with desperation, and I could tell he believed every word he was saying. None of us even thought about it. Kyle opened the door first, and the rest of us followed, jogging after the guy as he bolted down the trail. We left everything behind, our coats, our gear, just running after him because it felt like we did not have a choice. The trail led us closer to the lake, but something was not right. He was not heading toward the fishing spots we knew. Instead, we were moving toward a more secluded part of the lake where the ice was always thinner. A bad feeling started creeping up my spine, but before I could say anything, it was already too late. As we got closer to the lake, my stomach sank. That uneasy feeling I had earlier was now full-blown alarm. Just ahead, two men stood near the edge of the ice. They were not dressed for fishing, not even close. They were standing completely still, like they were waiting for something. Or someone. I scanned them quickly, and my heart just about stopped. Both of them were holding guns. One of the men barked at us to stop, raising his weapon and aiming it straight at me. Let me tell you, there is no way to describe the kind of fear that grips you when a gun is pointed your way. It is like time freezes, and your brain can only focus on one thing: survival. I would not wish that feeling on my worst enemy. The guy who had led us here turned around slowly, and that was when it hit me: we had been played. He smirked, like he was proud of how easily we had fallen for his act. My hands clenched into fists as rage bubbled up inside me, but there was nothing I could do. The second man shouted at Nate, demanding his truck keys and everything else we had on us. It was clear they were not bluffing. Nate fished his keys out of his pocket and tossed them over without hesitation. The three of us emptied our pockets. I hesitated, trying to keep hold of my phone, but one of the guys snarled, "Phones too." I tried to argue, but his gun made it clear he was not taking no for an answer. Nate muttered something about his phone being in the truck, and the two men laughed like they thought it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. I could feel my blood boiling. How had we been so stupid? They took everything and herded us back up the trail at gunpoint. It all happened so fast that I barely had time to think. Once we reached the parking area, one of them jumped into Nate's truck and sped off, leaving us stranded. The other two disappeared into the woods, probably heading to their own vehicle. For a split second, I considered chasing them, but what good would it do? They had guns. We had nothing. We stood there in the freezing cold, stunned and furious. My hands were shaking, partly from the cold, but mostly from pure anger. That was when Nate reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He had lied about it being in the truck. I could have hugged him right then and there. He quickly dialed the police, doing his best to stay calm as he explained what had happened. Somehow, we still had service out there, and the dispatcher told us to stay put. The three of us huddled together for warmth, waiting for help to arrive. Nate was absolutely losing it, pacing around and kicking at trees while yelling every curse word he could think of. I tried to calm him down, but honestly, I was just as angry. It all felt so surreal. How could something like this happen to us? Of all days, why New Year's Eve? Eventually, the police showed up and took our statements. They asked us a million questions, but there was not much we could tell them. The guys had their faces covered, and we had no idea where they had gone. The officers were kind enough to drive us back to Kyle's house, which was the closest. By the time we got there, we were exhausted, freezing, and still in shock. As you might expect, Nate's truck was never found, and the men who robbed us were never caught. The whole thing still feels like a bad dream. Trevor thinks it was just dumb luck, wrong place, wrong time. He says those guys probably were not even planning to rob anyone but just seized the opportunity when we showed up. Maybe he is right, but I have a hard time believing it was all so random. How would they even know someone would come out to such a remote spot? And why wait out there in the freezing cold, armed and ready, for no reason? None of it makes sense, and the more I think about it, the more questions I have. Even now, years later, I cannot wrap my head around what happened that day.